the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany after Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland. It was the start of the largest and bloodiest war in history. A conflict fought around the world, in the air, on land, and on sea. A conflict that shaped the world order. The Second World War was fought on an unprecedented scale and intensity. Its outcome continues to shape our lives today. In this film, we will explore how this war came to be, tracing 10 steps that tipped Europe and the world over the brink. During the 1920s, there was a hope that the memory of the horrors of the First World War would prevent a future conflict. The British, in particular, had no desire to fight once again in Europe.
It's only 20 years since the war to end all wars, and the idea of fighting another one against the same enemy was unconscionable. And I think, particularly in Britain, among the elite, there was a great sense of surprise that they had survived the First World War, that these great homes, that the aristocratic system, capitalism, there hadn't been a revolution as there had been in Russia, and they didn't think that they would survive another war. And in some ways, although there wasn't a violent revolution, they didn't. The Attlee government, the creation of the welfare state, Britain was never the same again after the huge exertions of the Second World War.
Yet, only 20 years after the end of the First World War, Europe was heading once again for conflict. Starting at the very end of the 1920s, the global economy collapsed. World economic output dropped sharply. Unemployment hit between a quarter and a third of the labour force in some developed economies, and international trade halved. Germany was badly affected. Established politicians were discredited and swept aside as voters looked for radical solutions to economic woes. A previously peripheral party with a charismatic leader did well in German elections, winning 37% of the vote in November 1932. Its name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as the Nazi Party, and its leader was Adolf Hitler. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Hitler moved fast. In spring 1933, he effectively overthrew the parliamentary system, with laws allowing him to rule by decree. By the summer, he had outlawed all other parties. Within a year, he had merged all the great offices of state into one. He had supreme power as Germany's leader or Führer.
The Hitler government is underestimated in the West, as it's underestimated in Germany, because governments have only lasted about a year. There's 6 million people unemployed. And this sort of figure of Hitler seems faintly ludicrous to a seasoned statesman in the West with his marches and Charlie Chaplin moustache. Although a minority that says this man can't be trusted, and the foreign policy aims of the Hitler government, which are clear from Mein Kampf and clear from other things going on in Germany, are a great danger to us. The idea of war is so unpalatable that I think people were prepared to take him at his word because the alternatives were too awful to face. He's set out his ideas and his aims in Mein Kampf fairly consistently, and those people that really understood what the Hitler government was about had read Mein Kampf, but tons of people hadn't. So I find it absolutely astonishing that the major figure that was threatening world peace, he'd only produced one book. You would have thought they could have all read that one book, but they didn't. And the aims of restoring Germany's territorial integrity, regaining lost colonies, creating Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, defeating France, all of these are the consistent aims he has throughout the 30s.
What is stirring in Germany? To what climax are the millions of loyal followers being led by their forceful leader, Adolf Hitler? Withdrawing from the Disarmament Conference, resigning from the League of Nations, Hitler has frayed the world's nerves afresh. He is plunging his country into yet another election, surely one of the strangest ever to be held, for there will be no alternative candidate to the National Socialist nominee. The electors will be asked to signify yes or no as to whether they approve of Hitler's foreign policy.
In 1935, there was a referendum in the Saarland, a small but important piece of Germany confiscated by the Treaty of Versailles, which followed the First World War. The Nazis employed intimidation and bullying to achieve a favourable result. Opponents were kidnapped, beaten, and killed. The result of the referendum was an overwhelming majority to rejoin Germany. It was Hitler's first big success. The Tsar, with its valuable industries, would rejoin Germany. Within months of gaining supreme power, Hitler began to rearm Germany. The Treaty of Versailles denied Germany an air force or a large standing army. Hitler refused to abide by its terms and started rebuilding Germany's army and air force. He also pushed Britain to allow Germany an expanded navy.
It's fairly clear that he's breaking the Treaty of Versailles. He's creating an air force which is prescribed. He's talking about the need for a larger German navy. And then in March 1935, he announces the introduction of conscription. And the Treaty of Versailles had said that you could only have an army of 100,000 men in Germany. There are two reasons none of these things get challenged. And I think it's important that we remember that contemporaries didn't know that they were on an escalator. They didn't know that this demand would be succeeded by the next demand, succeeded by the next demand. Firstly, because they thought that Hitler just did want equality of status among the Western powers, and there was a huge sense, both in Britain and France, that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh and had created the Nazis. And if the Treaty of Versailles had been more lenient, then this sense of grievance wouldn't have arisen and the Weimar Republic might have survived. And if only Hitler were given that equality of status he demanded with the other great powers, Germany's a great country after all, then he might calm down and Europe could have that time of appeasement. Appeasement was not a dirty word then. It was used as a perfectly acceptable aim. And it was always a perfectly acceptable aim. The criticism is of how the policy was, whether it was going to work rather than not being a good aim. The other reason these tests aren't met is there's no appetite whatsoever for the only way of stopping them, which would have been a preventive war. Nobody was going to go and march into Germany to stop her having 500,000 man army rather than a 100,000, or even an air force.
The Rhineland is a large area of western Germany on the border with France, and fought over by the two powers for generations. After the First World War, the victorious Allies had insisted that Germany would not be allowed to station troops there or build defences. By 1936, Hitler felt confident enough to challenge this.
I think most historians now agree that the reoccupation of the Rhineland was the last chance of stopping a major war. Hitler marches into the Rhineland in March 1936, and it's been kept open. The French wanted to occupy it themselves, but they weren't allowed to by the British and the Americans at Versailles. But it's kept demilitarized because it's essentially the front door to Germany. This is the route through which the French army would march. Hitler's generals told him not to do it. Hitler was profoundly nervous and said later on, possibly boasting because it showed his nerves of steel, that it was the most nervous 48 hours of his life. And it would have dealt a huge blow to his prestige within Germany had he been ejected from this, and it would have increased dissatisfaction among his generals. Whereas after this, the generals and the far more cautious military are at a disadvantage when they're trying to restrain Hitler from other outlandish acts of foreign policy.
After the First World War, Austria's empire in Central and Southern Europe had disintegrated. Austria was now a small country of German speakers on Germany's border. Hitler himself was Austrian and saw it as entirely natural that Austria should be absorbed into the German Reich. In Britain, the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax were in no mood to fight.
The next major test is Austria, and it's not so much a test once it's happened, because once it's going on, there's pretty much nothing that the British and French, France, who is without a government at the time, as they tend to be at moments of crisis throughout this decade, there's very little they can do, and the Austrians seem to welcome the Germans. But as a point of view of deterrence, the British really give Hitler the green light. Lord Halifax visits Hitler at Berchtesgaden in November 1937 and effectively tells him that the British have no problem with the Germans incorporating the Austrians or incorporating the Sudeten Germans of Czechoslovakia, providing it's done peacefully. I think a lot of people would say, as the saying went at the time, better Hitler than Stalin at the Channel ports. They think that his intentions are limited and that if only they could get to some sort of readjustment of the European status quo, then there is no reason to have another war. And Eastern Europe, Central Europe, those are not British concerns.
But Hitler wouldn't stop there. Now that he'd been able to expand Germany's borders without foreign intervention, he aimed to absorb the German-speaking people of northwest Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, into the Reich as well.
Everyone realizes once Austria has been taken over that Czechoslovakia is going to be his next item that he wishes to consume. And the reasons for this are fairly obvious. All the fortifications defending Czechoslovakia are on the west, and by the absorption of Austria, he has turned the Czechs' defences. He can now attack them from the south, where they're very poorly defended. And there is this minority, this 3.25 million of ethnic Germans who had never been part of modern-day Germany. They were never part of Bismarck's Reich. They were part of the Habsburg Empire, and they have been razzled up by a sort of faux Nazi party to demand inclusion into the Reich. And Hitler wants to include these people because he is the ultimate pan-German nationalist, and he wants to include all Germans within the Reich. But he also wants to take over the whole of Czechoslovakia. It's a very rich country. It's got the world's largest munitions site at Skoda. And if your aim is ultimately to conquer living space, Lebensraum, in Eastern Europe and Russia, then Czechoslovakia has to be dealt with first. So it is both a strategic and it's an ideological, obvious next step. Chamberlain and Halifax continue to believe that a peaceful solution can be found. Hitler is very careful at every stage of whatever he's demanding, from the Rhineland to a larger army to Czechoslovakia or Poland. He always makes it seem like his demand is very reasonable. His language and the way he delivers it, in rants and raves and threats of war, is unreasonable, but he always says it's only a specific thing. And each time he always says that this is his last demand. The fact that nobody had realised that he'd continually broken his word by 1938 is fairly shocking, or the fact that Chamberlain and Halifax hadn't woken up to the fact that this was a serial liar is pretty shocking. But they think that a solution can be found, and there is a way of incorporating the Sudeten Germans into Germany peacefully. which ultimately happens. But they have not realised what others have realised, that Hitler isn't going to stop there. He wants the whole of Czechoslovakia, and he breaks the agreement within 5 months of it being made. Hitler moves into the Sudetenland following the Munich Agreement. There is a hiatus. I mean, the most famous and iconic moments of the appeasement story are Chamberlain's 3 flying visits to Hitler. At the first one, where they meet in Berchtesgaden, Chamberlain agrees that the Sudetens should be allowed to join with the Reich should they wish to, and he suggests that there should be a plebiscite referendum. He then returns to Britain and persuades the French, who are formally allied with the Czechs, to abandon them, that they must give in the Sudetenland. And the French do this. They pretend to be highly affronted to be asked to abandon their ally, but privately they've already decided that they can't fight for them anyway, but they just want to pin the blame on the British. Chamberlain, very pleased with himself, a week later returns to Germany, and this time he meets Hitler on the banks of the Rhine at Bad Godesberg. This is in around 20th to 24th of September 1938. And he says, "Isn't it marvellous? I've got you exactly what you want. The French have agreed to abandon the Czechs, and both the British and the French have told the Czechs that if you don't surrender this territory, then we will abandon you and you will have your most assured destruction." And Hitler, because he actually wants a little war and wants to keep upping the ante, says, that's great, but I'm afraid it's not good enough. I want it's got to happen much faster than you're saying, and we have to consider other minorities like Polish minority, a Hungarian minority. At that point, Chamberlain is still prepared to give in to Hitler's demands, even though it's very clear Hitler has no interest in a peaceful solution. But the British cabinet, led by Halifax, most interesting, Halifax at this crucial moment becomes a resistor, not an appeaser. At this point, the British cabinet revolts and rejects Hitler's terms. And for one brief week, it looks as if we are going to go to war over Czechoslovakia. People dig trenches in Hyde Park. They're trying on gas masks. The Territorial Army is being called up. The Royal Navy is being mobilised. At the absolute last moment, when Chamberlain is in the midst of a speech in the House of Commons, talking about the preparation of war, the telephone in the Foreign Office rings, and it is the British ambassador in Germany saying that Hitler is inviting the great powers, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, for a conference at Munich to find a peaceful solution. And that leads to the Munich Agreement, which is sort of actually far less exciting than the previous summits. By the time the British and French prime ministers board their aeroplanes, it's a done deal. The Sudetenland is going to be surrendered, and it's a sort of face-saving exercise. Hitler's decided against war. They've decided to give in. It's just an agreement.
Then, in March 1939, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement and annexed the whole of Czechoslovakia, a humiliation for Chamberlain. The Czech leader was forced to go to Berlin and effectively signed his country over to Germany. On the 19th of March 1939, German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia. In Britain, opponents of Chamberlain's policy of appeasement had tried desperately to warn of its dangers. Men like veteran politician Winston Churchill. Dismissed as a warmonger, his warnings now appeared to be prophetic.
The decisive moment, though, is the rejection and violation of the Munich Agreement in March 1939, when Hitler, beyond any doubt, proves that he is an untrustworthy man who is not merely seeking to incorporate Germans into his Reich. He is after territorial aggrandizement on a Napoleonic scale, something which Churchill and others had been claiming. And that is, I think, the watershed moment.
Through the snow, the legions of occupation march into Czechoslovakia. This rapid stroke, which has outraged all freedom-loving nations of the world, is carried out with military exactitude. Artillery rolls into Prague and mounts guard on the Hradčin, the castle of King Wenceslas. Infantry, too, stride confidently through the streets of the city, now reduced to the capital of a protectorate. Here and there, citizens of German origin give the conquerors a welcome, but Czechs either watch sullenly or stay away. Presently, from a window of the castle, you may catch a glimpse of Hitler himself contemplating his new conquest. Though the great powers remain at peace, this new shock, following hard upon a period of apparent improvement in international relations, appalled the world. Witness the questions addressed to Hitler by Mr. Chamberlain in his speech at Birmingham.
Britain and France now faced the prospect of war. They began to look for allies.
Or if they have to fight Germany, they want a two-front war from the beginning, and they think that Poland is the most substantial military power in the East, and so they guarantee Poland, then they guarantee Romania, they guarantee Greece, there's an agreement with Turkey. Suddenly there are deterrents and alliances going out left, right and centre, but they're definitely not longing for war.
But Hitler was also looking for allies. In August 1939, fascist Germany stunned the world by announcing a pact with the communist Soviet Union. This Nazi-Soviet pact meant that Germany could count on the Russian superpower not to intervene and block Hitler's next steps in Eastern Europe. It was a terrible blow for Britain and France, and left their new ally Poland threatened from east and west. Hitler's gaze now fell upon Poland. Huge swathes of the country had been part of Germany until the end of the First World War. He was emboldened, certain that once again he would get his way.
Hitler keeps pushing because he doesn't believe that the British and French will actually fight. One of the biggest problems of the Munich Agreement is he thinks that they will continually give in. It's not clear whether he would have curtailed his plans had he been convinced that the British and French would fight for Poland. But he was determined to see the Greater German Reich in his lifetime, and he didn't think he was going to live much longer. And he also saw that the British and French were belatedly closing the arms gap, which he had opened up. This was the moment. So it was boldness on his part, determination to see his programme through, but also an unwillingness to believe the British and the French when they said that they were going to fight for Poland.
On September the 1st, 1939, German troops stormed across the border into Poland. Britain and France demanded they withdraw and threatened war if they didn't. Hitler called their bluff.
Hitler's continually assured by the completely egregious Joachim von Ribbentrop, his foreign minister and one-time ambassador to London, the most bitter Anglophobe you could imagine, continually assured that Britain will not fight. He says again and again and again, and there's a war party within the Nazi hierarchy, and there's a peace party, and Ribbentrop is leading the war party, and the war party, which Hitler is obviously part of and a leading member of, the war party win. When Britain declares war and Britain's ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson, hands a note to the German Foreign Ministry, and then von Ribbentrop delivers this to Hitler. Hitler, apparently according to his interpreter, turned to von Ribbentrop and said, "What next?" in a very angry way, making it clear so the interpreter thought that he was surprised that the British had declared war and was angry with Ribbentrop.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
France and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, the end of a process of miscalculations, gambles and bluffs. The policy of appeasement and the reluctance of the major powers of Europe to stand up to Adolf Hitler had led the continent blundering into a catastrophic war just over 20 years since the last one had ended. It was a tremendous failure of statecraft. A conflict that started in Europe would eventually spread from the Arctic oceans to the deserts of Africa, the islands of the Pacific to central China. The human cost was vast. Its legacy endures. Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.